The BJ Fogg behavioral model shows three elements need to converge at the same time in order for a behavior to happen. And those three things are motivation, abilities, and triggers. When one of these things doesn't occur, the behavior itself or the intended behavior itself is not going to happen. And this was a theory brought about really by studying how people respond to technology, to social media specifically. Fogg applied these ideas to how people responded to certain triggers that would pop up. For example, on Facebook, the trigger that you have some kind of a notification, the red dot syndrome, was something worth taking a look at. And why would people click on that and what's involved in that? So he came up with this concept of motivation, abilities, and triggers. I think it was about 2008 when this came about. He uses a graph to explain this. Let me see if I can't do the same thing. So we have this x-axis and y-axis. On the x-axis we have motivation and the level of motivation, if it's high or if it's low. And on the other axis, we have ability, and then the continuum there, if it's hard or if it's easy. And you see that that's reversed there, okay? And then as we go through and graph motivation and ability, if where things fall onto there, it ends up becoming a trigger. A trigger happens when something happens beyond this line, to the right of this line. If the ability is hard and the motivation is low, then the trigger is going to fail. But if the ability is easy and the motivation is high, then the trigger is going to succeed. It all comes together. But it's, as everything that we study here in persuasion, is not quite that simple. Let's take a look at motivation. Out of the three ideas here of the Fogg model. Motivation, he breaks down into three different areas. One is sensation, anticipation, and the last one being this concept of cohesion. Sensation is pretty straightforward in terms of why we might be motivated to do something. Does it feel good? Or is it a negative motivation, like a diet perhaps, in that respect, in terms of hunger pangs that we might experience? We like the paradise side of this equation as opposed to the painful side of that equation. So typically if things appeal to our pleasure centers in our brains, then chances are we'll have a higher likelihood of going through and responding to changing our behavior, or to be persuaded, as the case might be. The second idea is that of anticipation, and this gets into a real simple application of emotion, and those emotions are hope and fear. So again, not to put too fine of a point on this, if we are hopeful, we have a tendency maybe to be motivated to change behavior in a way that is more positive. However, as we discussed in class, one of our biggest motivators when it comes to persuasion is fear. And so that can go through and as a motivator combined with some level of ability and then end up in a trigger. And that's done fairly easily. Cohesion is the third idea here, and that's where we get into some level of acceptance or rejection based on the behavior that we put out there. So, for example, the first image that I showed you was a seatbelt coming together for all intents and purposes for somebody in our classroom. And there's this idea of cohesion. If you wear your seatbelt, you must be okay. If you don't wear your seatbelt, you must be crazy. We like acceptance. We like to be included. We don't like to be rejected. And so that can become a social motivator to get us into compliance, to persuade us to go through and exhibit a certain behavior. So that's motivation. Let's get into this concept of abilities. And abilities boils down to this concept of, or to the idea of how simple is the task for us to accomplish, okay, in order for us to reach an ability in that respect. When I think of simplicity, especially when it comes to things dealing with technology and our ability to go through and find stuff, Amazon certainly has conquered that whole concept. I don't think shopping could possibly be any easier than going on to Amazon. I mean, you don't have to even get dressed. You can go on Amazon, find your product, order it, and then have it shipped to you the next day. And not just products, we can find all kinds of our media that we're looking for in terms of books or video or broadcasting. It's all there. It's all there in one touch. One thing that might not be quite so simple is have you ever responded to a survey on a grocery store or a retail store's receipt? There's something more involved here. There's an additional step where we have to put the URL into our computer or into our iPhone and put in a code and then go through and follow it there. And so we have really a higher failure rate with this type of ability than we do perhaps with just shopping on Amazon, just because there's a couple more steps involved in what's going on. Plus you have to handle that really nasty kind of feeling receipt as a result of that. There's certain simplicity factors. The first couple are obvious, like time and money. If you have the time, and if it's going to not cost you a whole lot, then chances are you're going to go through and engage there in terms of your ability. Effort, again, if it's really easy to do, the less effort required, then the more likely it is that you're going to go through and engage in that. And then the last three here are interesting. B.J. Fogg gets in this concept of brain cycles. And we're going to talk about this when we get into class next time in terms of what's called the dual process theory. I hinted a little bit to this the first night we got together in terms of what's the likelihood of us engaging into a certain behavior? Is there a high likelihood? Is it elaborative? Or is there a low likelihood that it's really non-elaborative? There's two brain cycles. One's very simple and it appeals to us on an emotional standpoint, and the other one is more logical and appeals to us more on a cognitive standpoint. So we'll get into that there as we talk about dual process theory, but I think that's what Fogg is talking about when it comes back to brain cycles. The second one here out of these last three is this concept of social deviance. Is it out of the norm for us? Is it out of our norm or our social norm or our theological norm, in fact, for us to go through and reach that, whatever that ability might be? And we talked about drinking alcohol, for example. That becomes something that might be socially deviant. Is it something that goes against our own impeccability, our own being impeccable with our word there? If it's a low social deviance, we'll be okay. If it's a high social deviance, the ability probably will never engage that way. And then lastly here, Fogg goes through and talks about, is it out of our routine? And if it is, then chances are we will not engage there in terms of that being a simplicity factor. We will not engage in the ability. And I beg to differ here a bit, because most of us are also looking, though, for something that's novel. We're looking for novelty. We're looking for something that might be linked to a very powerful persuasive motivator, which is nostalgia, right? And so if we find those two things that come together, something we haven't done in a long time, something that relates back to perhaps a very positive social, cultural, or psychological memory for us, the more novel that might be, the more we might have the ability to break out of the routine and do something that is more novel, that brings about that concept of novelty, which I think is interesting. I'm interested to know what you think about this as well. We might put up a discussion here as we talk about these things, whether you agree with them or not. There, everything's theoretical here, and that's how theories work. All right, so from abilities, then let's move into triggers, the last part. The last part of the trivium of the B.J. Fogg model. He indicates that triggers fall into three different areas: the facilitator, the signal, and the spark. The spark is what triggers us emotionally, okay? How we feel about it. And again, it's the hope or fear kind of thing that might evolve into that. And certainly there are other ranges of emotions involved, but those are the two most powerful. And fear and hope, I should probably put it into that hierarchy. The facilitator is what encourages the trigger, okay? It's the motivator that's out there that encourages us to go through and do that. And then lastly is the actual signal. This says something that says, you better do it. So, for example, I'm going to go back to the whole seatbelt thing, okay? As you get into the car, and if this is not a habit for you yet, because Fogg would argue later on that we do these things on a repetitive basis, then it turns into a habitual behavior. there. But if we don't have that habit, we sit in a car and we put the key in the ignition and we turn it on, and we have the ding, 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 or the light, or both of those, the light on the dashboard and the auditory sound of us to go through and put on our seatbelt. And that might become a facilitator and a signal at the same time, okay? If we're thinking maybe we have an image of our grandchild taped up on our rearview mirror, that could become an emotional motivation, a spark to go through and say, oh, well, I love this individual so much that I want to make sure I can see them again, so I'm going to put on my seatbelt. The signal is going to be perhaps the seatbelt itself, or if you notice on your seatbelt where it locks into, it's a different color. It's a signal red. And it's a signal red for a reason. It says you got to do this. Maybe there's a sticker someplace in your vehicle that says fasten your seatbelts as well. So all those kinds of things come together, facilitator, signal, and spark, that create a trigger that responds to both the motivation and your ability to fulfill that kind of behavior. Are we going to get you to put your seatbelt on yet? These triggers are extrinsic. We are surrounded by them all the time. In fact, we are bombarded by signals all over the place. Persuasive attempts, okay, to get us to comply with some type of behavior that's out there. This is Times Square, but just go on to Facebook and you're bombarded as well through social media. Okay, so we have those extrinsic influences, but then we also have intrinsic influences. And these influences are more value-based, okay? They come from within. They might not be as bright and shiny as everything else that's out there, but these are very motivating for us. And this isn't Fogg speaking, this is me now, okay? We are motivated based on our conviction, based on the experiences, the wisdom that we've garnered along the way. And that can happen on these different levels. It happens to us cognitively, it happens to us emotionally or through that affection. And it happens through this concept of conviction. And that conviction happens on two different levels, the ideological level and the motivational level. And these are two categories of persuasion that we'll get into during the rest of the semester. The ideological persuasions, well, both of these are pretty difficult. In fact, one would argue that motivational persuasion has to happen before the ideological. The motivational persuasion is getting us to change a behavior, like putting on a seatbelt. The ideological persuasion, the ideological conviction is I'm putting on a seatbelt because I want to preserve my life. So it's as opposed to I'm not going to wear a seatbelt because it's not going to happen to me. So it's a paradigm shift that happens within those. All right, so that's how the BJ Fogg model works, how it comes together, and we'll have a little activity for you to go through and make that application.